What we have to understand about culture, firstly, is that culture is not something which exists. Culture is something which is created and which is recreated within the communities and societies which display those cultures. So culture is created socially. In trying to, culture at the same time is something which is expressed through the social norms and values that are witnessed in particular social groups and within societies. Culture, social norms, and values, however, do shape agricultural productivity. And they do so because social norms and values have material consequences. That social norms and values allow certain actors in political economy to exert power over others, and that power is manifest in the control of labor. This is particularly witnessed when we look at gender relations, that social norms and values that surround patriarchal relations in the countryside allow men to exert power over women. And this has a material consequence, the control of women's labor. And in that sense, culture and social norms and values shape agricultural productivity by shaping the ability to deploy women's labor into agricultural production for the benefit of a few at the expense of the many. So one should always be closely aware of the material dimensions of the cultures that we see and the social norms and values in which we work. Because from an agrarian political economy point of view, it is those material expressions that give rise to power and privilege, to authority, and to the social determination of changing transformations in the countryside. There's a lot of research that's been done on large scale data sets over the course of almost 30 years in Eastern and Southern Africa, which indicates that women, when they manage land, are less productive on their plots of land than men who manage land. A lot of the reasons for this, which have been advanced, are derived from those very same data sets. So you do the estimation, the quantitative estimation of why there is this gap in productivity between women and men. You determine what that gap is, and then you look into the data to try and see, well, what does the data say about what the gap may be? The problem with this kind of an approach is that it's based upon the idea that these data sets ask all of the right questions of all of the right people. And if we look carefully and closely at most large-scale data sets which are used for purposes around rural development, many of these do not ask all of the right questions, and they certainly do not ask the right people. So it is necessary to go beyond the quantitative estimates of these gender gaps in agricultural productivity to try and get a better understanding of why women may be less productive than men on plots of land. And to strip it down to its most fundamental, we really have to recall that in much of Eastern and Southern Africa, small-scale petty commodity production has two principal inputs. That is land and that is labor. And this means then that the supply of labor is an important determinant of agricultural productivity. Now, women have less labor time to be able to spend on their plots of land than men. And the reason they have less time to be able to spend on their plots of land are basically two. Firstly, women are responsible for unpaid care and domestic work around the home, what some people would call the acts of social reproduction. And these activities can very commonly consume between 5 to 7 hours a day. This includes things such as cleaning, cooking, household health care, informal household education, childcare, and elder care. All of these things are very, very time consuming. And because they take up women's time, it means they have less labor time available to them to be able to work on their plots of land. Secondly, however, in many instances, women are expected to work on jointly managed plots or on male managed plots before they work on their own plots of land. And when this is the case, this also means that in addition to the unpaid care and domestic work responsibilities that they have to do, they have another set of on-farm tasks that have to be done before they can even think about working on their own plots of land, working essentially for their husbands as farm labor. And so what this means cumulatively is that women have less labor inputs to use on the plots of land that they operate. And this, I would argue, would be a very strong determinant of lower levels of agricultural productivity. But this doesn't show up in the data. And a proper economist would turn around and say, well, if we don't have the data, all this is a hypothesis, and we need to go and collect the data to be able to substantiate it, to which I wouldn't disagree. But it is a hypothesis which I have substantiated through field work up and down the Eastern and Southern African region. As it's historically constructed, the agrarian question is concerned with examining whether or not capitalist relations of production are or are not developing in rural areas. One way of looking at this in a very concrete way is the problematics which have been identified by Henry Bernstein based upon the work of Terry Byers. So the first problematic is one of production. To what extent are technical coefficients of production changing? And this is witnessed in changing access to agrarian assets. It is witnessed in changing patterns of labor commodification, and it is witnessed in changing access to and benefit from technical change in the countryside, the problematic of production. The second problematic is that of accumulation, the terms and conditions under which agriculture is contributing to growth both within the countryside and more generally, both at the level of the accumulating farm, but also at the level of the sector as a whole. And then the third aspect of the agrarian question are politics. How do changing technical coefficients of production and processes of accumulation shape and be shaped by rural politics? Now, when we think of gender and the agrarian question, what we really have to hone in upon is the fact that all three of these problematics are gendered. That processes by which access to assets occurs and changes are gendered processes. That processes by which labor commodification takes place are gendered processes. And that technical change is not a gender neutral process, just as it is not a class neutral process. That technical change occurs in very distinct ways and brings very distinct benefits to specific groups. Similarly, processes of accumulation that occur in the countryside at the level of the farm production unit are not a gender neutral process, because these processes of accumulation confer benefits on those within the farm unit, and the farm unit is a gendered unit. So benefits from accumulation should not be assumed to accrue to everyone in the accumulating unit, the farm, but will be differentially distributed within that accumulating unit, within the farm, between men, between women, between the older, between the younger. They will have differential access to the benefits of accumulation. And this means that across the sector as a whole, the process of accumulation is a gendered process. And thirdly, rural political formations and processes, again, are profoundly gendered in the sense that we've seen many instances of women organizing around the world over the course of the past century in support of peasant movements, within peasant movements to gain greater recognition and voice in those movements. And in fact, in the past 30 years, women's organization to shape the direction of those peasant movements. So rural political voices are gendered. So if we look at the agrarian question and look at it in terms of these buyers type problematics of production, accumulation, and politics, these are very gendered. Let me put it in a slightly different angle. Henry Bernstein has also identified what he considers to be the four central questions of agrarian political economy, which focus in upon the concerns of the agrarian question. And those four central questions are: who owns what, who does what, who gets what, and what do they do with it? In terms of who owns what, patterns of ownership, this is gendered. In terms of who does what, who working patterns, labor patterns, this is gendered. In terms of who earns what, where do incomes flow, this is gendered. And in terms of what do they do with it, how is money spent, this is gendered. So gender writ large shapes the character of the agrarian question. And it is only by centering gender within the agrarian question and the way in which we conceptualize it that we can have a properly engendered agrarian question, which allows us to have a much fuller understanding of the terms and conditions by which capitalism is or is not developing in the countryside. Gender is central to understanding this because gender has material consequences as well as ideological consequences.